Personality is the unique way that individuals think, feel, and behave. And that's a very broad explanation for personality, but we should also include aspects of character as well as temperament into that sort of discussion. But only beginning with a definition doesn't get us too far. There are a number of theories that set into motion the notion of personality, and the first one of those, as you might suspect, goes all the way back to Sigmund Freud and the psychodynamic theories. Now, there are five particular propositions, we'll call them, that are related to the psychodynamic approaches. The first one of those is that, very simply, that much of the mental process is unconscious. In other words, we're not ever completely aware of what goes on in our unconscious mind, and as a part of that, often our personalities are completely unknown, at least in some aspects, to how it is we function in daily life. Secondly, mental processes also operate in parallel, meaning that there are numerous aspects of personality that might be running alongside each other at any particular time. Third, when it comes to psychodynamic approaches, remember that early experience affects personality development. In other words, we are currently, as individuals, aspects of every single event that you and I have encountered across the entirety of our lifespans. Everything that has occurred is working in some way or other, good or bad, or even indifferent, to make you the person you are today. And fourthly, mental representations will often guide our interactions. In other words, there are certain mental representations or things that we consider or think about that represent certain other aspects of our personalities that tend to drive the interactions we have amongst ourselves. And lastly, regulation of the sexual and aggressive feelings is crucial to understanding psychodynamic properties. Again, all of this stems from Sigmund Freud when he stressed the significance or the role of the significance of the unconscious mind. I'm sure there's a diagram of some sort in your book that will make reference to an iceberg. What is above the water is what you and I see as part of each other's personalities. All of the iceberg that is under the water is happening in the unconscious. In other words, we're not aware that it's going on at any particular time. And for Dr. Freud, bear in mind that the libido, or our sexuality, is the energy that's generated by our sexual instinct. It is inborn, it's ingrained as a part of our personality, and those two particular ideas get together from the unconscious perspective to drive a lot of what Sigmund Freud thought was our personality across time. Now, interestingly enough, as a part of that, you could take Sigmund Freud's theories and squeeze them down into a couple of little bitty objects. In other words, human creatures are all about two things. We're all about being sexual. We're all about wanting to harm one another. Basically, it means that all we're concerned about is the continuation of our own species, and if it's necessary, we'll be aggressive with one another to accomplish that. Now, again, according to Freud, personality was constructed, put together by two or three different other aspects. The first one of those is the id, which is functions by what's called the pleasure principle. In other words, what I want is what I want, and I want it right now. That is the unconscious mind. The ego is the reality principle. In other words, the ego deals with what is going on in real time. You and I, when we are interacting face to face, are encountering each one of our own egos. Now, the superego is the interference or the conscience that exists in a person. In other words, the superego is the thing or the aspect of personality that keeps our egos from acting foolish. Now, an example that comes to mind is you're in the grocery store, and for whatever reason, you've encountered something that makes you terribly angry. Now, as a part of that, you become, or at least unconsciously, a significant amount of aggression begins to boil up. And as a result, you may get foolish with your buggy, run into some of the end caps in the grocery store, even run over somebody with your buggy. I've known individuals as clients, not my own clients, but other clients, that what they wanted to do when they got aggressive was to get in their vehicles and run over someone. A couple of them did that. They wanted that release right now, and they did what was necessary. For them, it provided great pleasure. Their superego wasn't able to intervene to the point of being able to stop them. Now, what happens is that there are a number of conflicts between what the id is driving for from the pleasure principle and the rules and restrictions that the superego pose on us because or as part of the human condition. In other words, culture decides what's appropriate. I want to kill my neighbor. Well, my conscience or my superego is going to jump up and say, now, Scott, that might not be the most appropriate way to take care of this particular difficulty. You might want to reconsider that option. Now, I'm giving lots of extra words to it, but it boils down to the fact that we deal with our unconscious minds, the everyday example of our ego presenting itself to the world, and our conscious minds, or what we would also call the conscience, or the superego, is that factor that runs interference so that we don't end up acting as foolish as we might. There are also, according to Freud, 5 different stages of personality development. Now, interestingly enough, they are all based on how human creatures develop from very, very young to very, very old. Now, the first one of those stages is the oral stage. Where does a baby receive his or her satisfaction in life? It's from food, from being able to nurse, whether it's from the breast or whether it's from a bottle. That is regulated, the id is regulated by the pleasure principle. That's where a baby receives all of his or her satisfaction. Now, the next phase in Freudian development is the anal phase, and it's exactly what you might think it is. Where, not so much where, but what do parents, one of the first things that parents want their children to be able to do besides sleep through the night? Now, most parents I've encountered will tell you that they would really, really enjoy it if their children were potty trained. I tend to use the words housebroken. Now, what boils down to this in this particular stage, called the anal phase, the secondary stage, is that human creatures begin to exercise some sort of control over body elimination. And as a result, that's when the ego begins to develop. Now, the third stage is the phallic stage. Again, it suggests exactly what you think it might. It's when the superego development occurs, and it's also when we encounter what's known as the Oedipus or the Electra complex. Now, the Oedipus complex takes place in men or boys, and that is when, please don't be overly offended, it is a psychological phase when some men are very interested in killing their fathers so that they might have sex with their mothers. Now, from the Electra complex perspective, it works in reverse. It's when women want to kill their mothers so they can be sexual with their fathers. And again, for most of us, certainly in 2021, such a concept sounds absolutely outrageous. However, at the base, primal human level of development, such urges do occur. Now, fourth is the latency phase, and that is when human creatures begin to consciously repress, squeeze down their sexual expression. Often, again, because it's repression, it takes place at an unconscious level. You'll notice that most children, somewhere around the age of between about 4, 5, and 6, and as old as 8 or so, how do they play? They tend to play with same-sex people. In other words, little boys play with little boys, little girls play with little girls, and in fact, for each sex, the other one has cooties, or whatever it is they call it nowadays. And that's when they're just not interested in playing with one another at all, at any level. There's no significant interaction between the sexes at that stage. Now, the fifth stage is the genital phase. Again, that is when the overall sexuality of an individual reawakens and begins to express itself. That's where individuals find their satisfaction in life, is through sexual activity. Now, fixation is a process that stems from each one of these 5 stages. And what fixation means is that it's when a person attaches him or herself at some inappropriate level to one of these 5 stages. And what that means is that there are likely conflicts that have occurred with that individual at one of those particular stages. A great example is someone who's stuck in the oral phase, or at least having difficulty maneuvering through that phase, will be someone who has some sort of oral need on a consistent basis. I've heard it expressed from the standpoint of individuals who smoke. Maybe, I'm not saying they are, but I'm saying they may be or may have some sort of conflict that arose for them during the oral phase, and they haven't dealt with that conflict yet. And then what happens is that we have developed adult personality characteristics that reflect what we perceive to be those childhood inadequacies. Again, it's a fascinating subject. Personality is great, great fun, and we could spend much more than an entire semester just unpacking aspects related to personality. Now, one of Freud's contemporaries was Carl Jung, and Carl Jung split off from Freud with in a couple of specific ways. And the first one of those is that Jung thought that there was what he called a collective unconscious versus a personal unconscious. In other words, everything that took place in the unconscious mind was part of this large aspect of unconscious thought that no one, to any degree, was tapping into. His particular theory is also focused on introverts and extroverts. The difference, very plainly, is that introverts gain their strength and energy from being alone, while extroverts tend to need to be with other people to gain their strength. Now, what also occurred for Jung is there was the rational versus irrational individual. In other words, could people think straight to any significant degree? Again, Jung and Freud separated when Jung decided to propose the collective unconscious. As a part of that collective unconscious, he noted what he called archetypes. There were personality types that represented archetypes or significant people-like instances in the unconscious. There was the sage, the king, the queen, the magician, things of that nature. And each one of those personality representations had particular characteristics that would apply to different personalities. After Jung came Adler, and Adler is where we learned about the inferiority complex. And Adler suggested that there are areas in life when we feel inadequate or inferior to those around us for whatever reason, and that then, if not dealt with, will develop into some sort of inferiority complex that drives our personality and behavior, meaning that we'll feel less than on a consistent basis, and as a result, don't have as interesting or as profitable interactions among ourselves. After Adler, we encountered a woman by the name of Karen Horney. And Karen Horney's theory suggested that everything in life, certainly personality, stems from some level of anxiety. And we're trying to deal with that on a consistent level all of the time. Now, please note that I include notions of anxiety as a large umbrella. And I would say that the majority of life is about some level of angst. We're uncomfortable. We encounter some sort of dis-ease related to certain types of actions or interactions. And as a result, we're constantly, at some level, trying to work through that level of angst so that we can move on into other aspects of our personality development. After Karen Horney came Eriksson, and his theory was based on a social situation, not on individuals. And Eriksson suggested a theory that was based, again, on social, inclusive of sexuality. And there are 8 different levels to Eriksson's theory. It should be noted in your textbook. If you'd like to get a diagram of that, you can certainly Google it. It is fascinating information. And it also includes the concept of time. And for Eriksson, each individual is dealing with a particular struggle or conflict that he or she has to resolve before they can move to the next phase. And what that simply means, for example, in the first stage, is trust versus mistrust. And what a child, as a small infant, is trying to do is to determine if the caregivers are trustworthy. Can they be trusted to feed him or her? Can they be trusted to care for him or her? Can they provide shelter for that little child? And the infant is unconsciously trying to resolve that inner conflict with him or herself. And as a result, if those needs are not met, it's quite possible that a child will not navigate appropriately through that particular stage, which could, over time, create some other relating difficulties across the lifespan. After Eriksson came Ch10 Smith, and in her particular perspective, we approach, interpret, and explain that level of personality from numerous psychodynamic principles and kind of squeeze them all together as in some big, large conglomerate of some sort. She takes different aspects of each one of those, including Freud, and created her own particular personality theory. Now, from the evaluative perspective, when we try to discern to what extent psychodynamic theory is valid, there is some level of support for the concept of the unconscious mind. There is some level of research that suggests the validity of such a thing. Interestingly enough, for the most part, that's all. When it came to anything that Freud proposed individually, there were a handful of different difficulties. The first one of those is that he used his own clients to be research subjects. He had no control subjects. So because of the research challenges, much of his data or much of anything that he would have put out related to data was considered inconclusive at best. And there is very little that can be scientifically studied from an unconscious perspective. If you don't know it's there, it's really hard to study. Now, after Freud and the psychodynamic folk, we encountered humanistic philosophies. Now, the humanistic philosophies are also referred to as client-centered approaches, which means simply that they focus on the particular needs of one individual at one time versus a collective. It also deals with the superiority of positivity when compared to negativity. In other words, positive responses to personality are always going to be better than negative responses. Again, it sounds somewhat logical to us in 2021, but when those proposals came forth, they were novel at those particular times. Now, the individual most associated with humanistic approaches is Carl Rogers. It's also referred to as Rogerian, if you want to get really specific, when it comes to certain types of interventions. And for Carl Rogers, he dealt with self-actualization and the fact that it depended on the proper development of the self as an individual. In other words, when the real self and the ideal self don't match, anxiety and disordered behavior will result. In other words, if I have a perceived notion of how I present myself in public, but my real self knows full well that I am not that way, I'm likely going to encounter some sort of difficulty that inhibits my ability to relate with others well. And certainly, the ability I possess to relate with myself is going to suffer to some degree. The main concept from the humanistic approach is unconditional positive regard. And what that means, therapeutically speaking, is that it helps the formation of the self-concept and helps create congruency between the real and the ideal self. It leads to a fully functioning and appropriately functioning human creature. Now, therapeutically speaking, when it comes to interventions, a way to see such client-centered approaches would be a person sitting in my office and they're telling me about some difficulty. I'm upset with my spouse because of X, Y, and Z. And the therapist might parrot back to the client. So you're telling me that there are some sort of conflicts that you have between you and your spouse. You give the information back to the client, worded differently, and what should happen is if the therapist doesn't have it right, then the therapist expects the client to offer a correction so that both of them can end up on the same sheet of music. Now, along with the Rogerian approach, including self-actualization, Ch10 Smith also inserted herself here in this particular aspect and thought that we could approach, interpret, and explain personality from that perspective. Now, again, the humanistic approach is, we'll say, somewhat, at the very least, outdated. However, the majority of any relatively contemporary psychological intervention will have some level of affirmation for the individual, such that the person is able to develop a more congruent notion between the self and what he or she perceives as the ideal self. Now, from the evaluative perspective related to humanistic approaches, again, the humanistic therapeutic interventions are not scientifically grounded, but they have been very, very effective in therapy situations. After humanistic approaches, we need to consider trait theories. Now, personality traits are different aspects of personalities that combine to present the individual to others. Now, the first one of those folks we'll consider is Allport. He whittled down a list of personality traits from 18,000 down to 2,800, and then eventually down to 200 personality traits. Ch10 then reduced that number of traits down to 16 using what's called the statistical factor analysis, which means, again, very simply, is that all of that original 18,000 was categorized and subcategorized to the point that all of those traits were eventually squeezed down to elements related to about 16. Now, out of those 16, theorists, as well as those who do therapeutic interventions, squeeze those down into what's called the Big Five. And the Big Five is, you can use in an acronym, and it's called OCEAN, and it includes the five-factor model of personality. The O stands for openness to one's experience. The C refers to conscientiousness. The E is extroversion. The A is agreeableness. The N is neuroticism. Now, research supports the five-factor model across virtually all cultures and specific species. The five-factor model is also tied to brain and genetic components. Again, Jaylene Smith is a factor here related to this personality perspective. When we're evaluating trait theories, it's important to remember that trait theories are primarily descriptive rather than necessarily explanatory. They also have discovered that human complexity may not fit into such a small model. Behavior is also the product of traits manifested within the environmental situation, and the interaction of the two is often most revealing, which basically means this. Some individuals will behave differently depending on the context. Do you behave a certain way at home versus how you might behave in public when other people are watching? Those can create inner turmoil and inner conflict for some individuals. Now, after trait theory, we engage what's noted as cognitive social learning theories, which simply means that personality stems from a combination of our thought processes versus learning theory, all playing itself out in a social context, meaning that we mimic one another's behaviors to some degree. Albert Bandura is the flag bearer for the cognitive and social learning models. He dealt with performance standards versus self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is a word that you will hear related to those individuals who may be depressed to some degree or other. Self-efficacy is the level to which I think that I'm able to control my own circumstance in my own life. If my self-efficacy is low, then that simply suggests that I am feeling or thinking that I'm unable to control my own circumstances to any degree. The environment plays a particular role. The characteristics of the person and the behavior itself, again, interact to create the presented ego. Again, after Bandura, we encountered Julian Rotter. Rotter spoke about the locus of control. Is that internal or external? Simply meaning, are we able to exercise our own level of control related to how we experience life, or are we controlled by outside forces? Rotter also assumed that one's actions directly affect the events and reinforcement of one's experiences. Rotter thought that events and reinforcements are the result of luck, fate, as well as powerful others and their ability to assert themselves into our world. Personality, in the form of potential behavioral patterns, comes from an interaction between one's experiences or expectancies for success and the perceived value of the potential reinforcement. In other words, when it comes to our presentation with other individuals, what we expect as it relates to doing well and the perceived value, in other words, how valuable is this experience, and the reinforcement that we experience from those episodes, how do those interact? When we're evaluating the cognitive and social learning theories, there is lots of room for growth here. There is also an exceptional amount of explanatory power. I would encourage you to look up Albert Bandura. I will post a video of Mr. Bandura or Dr. Bandura. He's the individual who did the studies with the Bobo doll and how individuals learn behavior from watching others. A contemporary example of how this theory works is the study of video games. Some research suggests that video games and their violence increases episodic violence among younger people. It certainly occurs in the extremely young individual. For example, it's quite possible, and I've heard of, I haven't read about them, but I have heard about episodes when one individual will say at 5 or 6 is playing some video game, and when the video game, people die. And as a result, those individuals in the game often come back to life. So they don't fully understand the notion of death being permanent. And as a result, they may end up, unnecessarily, of course, killing a friend. They don't understand the concept that the friend will not come back to life. Now, that's not to suggest that the violent act is intentional. But what I am suggesting is some individuals will take behaviors they learn from video games and exercise them with other individuals. Again, it can be a significant struggle. There are a number of ways as well to assess personality. I do it on a fairly consistent basis. We can use interviews. If we were in the classroom, I would probably create a circumstance where I would interview someone to give you an idea of how it might occur in real time. That interview can be very structured or it can be unstructured, depending on what it is that suits you, I suppose. We can also include direct observation of how people behave and how they function, including rating scales and frequency of certain types of behavior. We can use objective tests. Tests like the 16PF, the NEO-PIR, and the MMPI-2, which are all semi-projective instruments, meaning that they point to and highlight certain types of behaviors and characteristics that are much more on the conscious level than the unconscious level. Now, the objective tests were developed by trait theorists and provide a detailed description of certain personality traits. Objective tests are very different from completely subjective tests. Now, primarily subjective tests include the TAT, which stands for the Thematic Apperception Test, and the Rorschach. The Rorschach is probably one that most folks have heard of before. It's a very interesting theory-based subjective instrument in which people look at ink blots. I'll post some information for you so you can get an idea of what that test includes. Now, what happens is that all of the information that a therapist would gather, or the person doing the assessment, most likely a psychologist, it goes into a computer program, and then they click a couple of buttons, and all of that information gets coded and then spits out pieces of information related to one's personality. Again, personality is a fascinating thing. I have spoken quickly for any number of reasons today, but I just want you to know that there is a lot more that we could unpack related to personality. I'll get it posted for you today as quickly as I can. The internet network is not working well today, even where I live, with my extra help early in the day. But just know that I'll post as much information as I can for you to give you as much access to learning more about personality as you might desire. Have a great week.